Northern Cape is South Africa's largest province, spanning nearly a third of the country's land area. Despite its vast size, it has the smallest population of all the provinces. Known for its diamond mines, extensive farming community, stunning landmarks like the Agriep Falls National Park, and its scenic coastline, the province is characterized by an arid climate with minimal rainfall. Locals often describe it as unbearably hot.
Before we continue, Christmas is almost here, and we've got something special for you. Imagine cozying up in the comfiest Christmas hoodies, designed to bring the magic of the holidays to life. Whether it's for you or the perfect gift for someone you love, our exclusive Christmas hoodies are here to make this season unforgettable. Don't wait. These one-of-a-kind designs are selling out fast. Visit uncoverizeshop.fourthwall.com now and grab yours before it's too late. And here's a little holiday treat. Use promo code CHRISTMAS to get 15% off your order. Let's make this Christmas the coziest one yet. Link is in the description.
Within the Northern Cape lies Kimberley, and a short distance away is the small, quiet hamlet of Krikwistad, where this story begins on April 6, 2012. That evening, a small pickup truck sped towards the police station in Krikwistad, screeching to a stop outside. A young boy jumped out, shouting, "They're all dead! They're all dead!" He was drenched in blood. The boy was 15-year-old Don Steen Camp. The Steen Camps were a prosperous and influential family, owning 5 generational farms. They were well known in the community, and their name carried weight in the area. Don told detectives that his entire family had been shot dead and he had narrowly escaped. He explained that he had been in the barn when he heard deafening gunshots from inside the house. The shots echoed through the open spaces, followed by an eerie silence. He started running for the house, and inside he found his mother, 43-year-old Crystal, father, 44-year-old Dion, and his younger sister, 14-year-old Martella. There was blood everywhere. He said Martella was still just alive and he tried to pick her up, but she had died there and then in his arms. He ran for his father's truck, and as he pulled away he heard more shots ringing out. As he got to the main gates, he saw 2 guns on the ground. He picked them up and put them into the truck. He then pulled over briefly to warn other farm workers, some of which were employees of the Steen Camps, before speeding away to the station. Police let him wash his hands and change his clothes, and he stayed there with them while other detectives rushed over to the sprawling farm in question, Novog, just a short drive from Huigwestad. When they got there, they could see that the lights were still on, but it was eerily silent. No windows were smashed, and there was no signs of forced entry that they could see. They called out, but no one called back. When they got inside, they saw Dion lying near the living room just a few feet away from Crystal and Martella, who were lying closely together near the kitchen. They were all dead, and it looked as if everything had happened so quickly. They had only just finished up with dinner when the attacks took place and the television was still on. The List 6 experts confirmed that all 3 had been shot both by a revolver and a rifle. The revolver was used first and the final shots came from the rifle. Dion had 3 gunshot wounds, 1 to the right shoulder, 1 behind the ear, and another in the chest. Crystal was shot in the shoulder, neck, and back, and Martella was shot twice in the body and twice in the head. Martella and Dion had blunt force injuries to their heads too, likely caused by the other side of the gun. One thing that the authorities would keep close to their chests and not publicly announce for a long time was that examinations performed by 2 doctors confirmed that Martella had also been raped between 12-24 hours before her death. The most recent injury she had sustained had actually reopened an old injury that had previously healed. Experts said that this showed she had been raped at least twice in her life. The injuries to Martella from that night showed that she was attacked in a far more violent way than her parents, and in the words of the authorities, she fought for her life like a tiger. Her wounds in particular were described as gruesome and torturous. Blood covered the walls and the kitchen countertops, and there was a big pool of blood outside by one of the trees. The blood by the tree was Martella's. Looking at the blood, the wounds, and the placement of their bodies, they believed that Crystal had been shot first from behind. Martella was shot second, and badly injured. She ran out the back door, leaving her blood outside. Dion was next. The position of his injuries made the experts think that he had made an attempt to run at his attacker to try and stop them, before being shot again and hit over the head. Satisfied that Dion was dead, The killer or killers then went to hunt for Martella, who was hiding and bleeding under a tree. She was then shot right in the face and struck over the head, which caused a significant amount of blood to gather there. All of these shots had been fired using a revolver. The killer then made their way back into the house to get a rifle, and remarkably Martella, who was still alive, managed to stumble back into the house where she saw her parents. Her bloody handprint was found on the house phone as she had tried to call for help. She then grabbed her father's arm and tried to pull him towards her, but she fell to the floor by her mom, Crystal. The killer then returned with the rifle and shot all of them one final time. Everything about this attack felt so personal, especially when it came to Martella. It was a harrowing set of visuals, and even the most hardened of officers said that tears filled their eyes as they looked at the scene and realized just how defenseless the family would have been and how frightening their last moments were, especially Martella's. But they quickly pulled it together, as this was now a huge murder investigation. The first thing that came to many people's minds was that it was a farm attack. Farm attacks have been prevalent in South Africa for years. And even though the Northern Cape is firmly in the position as the safest province, when it comes to these attacks, they do still happen there. However, journalists said that although they can go this badly, crimes this brutal seldom happened in this location, and the stories that make the papers were more petty crime or drug or alcohol related. The Steen Camp's house was big, and there were a lot of belongings to account for, but it didn't seem that anything was actually missing except a kitchen knife and some keys. A few of the couple's safes were open with the keys still dangling in the keyhole, but they still had things in them. There was cash on the side amounting to about $32,000, just over £1,000, along with the couple's credit cards. TVs, laptops and phones were all there too, and Dion and Crystal's cars were still in the barn area with the keys in the ignition. None of these items were hidden. They were just out in the open, and all added up, these were things that could make someone a lot of money. So why hadn't they been taken? The couple's gun safe was also wide open too, but it was still full of guns and ammunition. Experts said it didn't seem that a robbery was the motive, so this was ruled out. Despite a rumor circulating that Dion had killed his wife and daughter before turning the gun on himself, this theory was also eliminated. The news of what had happened was now spreading like wildfire. People could not believe that they had been with them just hours before at church. And now this had happened. Dion and Crystal had no enemies, no disgruntled employees the police could find, no one they owed money to, and no one in the community that even had anything bad to say about them. Leading the team was the provincial head of organized crime at the time, Colonel Dick Duval. And with 3 decades of experience, he was the best person to tackle such a complex case. He went back to the farm with Don so he could walk him through what had happened. Duval set a timer up as well so he could get a clearer picture of when this had actually taken place. Don told him he thought he was in the barn for about 45 minutes. He had left Dion and Martella watching a show together, and Crystal was working on the computer. He then heard the shots. He stayed still for about 10 minutes waiting for silence before running inside. When he found his sister, he picked her up and held her. In her final moments, she said she loved him before falling to the floor and grabbing at his t-shirt, which had been ripped. But this was not the t-shirt he had come into the station with. Don then walked them to his bedroom and picked up the ripped t-shirt to show them. They noticed some scratches on his neck, and he admitted that he and Martella had had a fight only a couple of hours before everything had happened. They asked what the fight was about, but he said he couldn't remember. They asked why he had taken the shirt off and changed, and he said that the sight of his sister's blood had repulsed him, so he had to get it off. He said after this, he ran back into the barn and hid, waiting for a few minutes before getting into his father's truck. He pointed out where he found the guns outside and where he had stopped to talk to the workers. He had then made the 4-mile drive to the police station. Everything was being tested, but there was a lot to get through, and it was a slow process. There were a few fingerprints on one of the drinking glasses found outside near the back door, but testing would confirm they were simply Martella's. Sadly, not all of the evidence was preserved and able to be tested. There was a green Jeep jacket belonging to Dion and a rug, both covered in blood. But the day after the murders, Crystal and Dion's cleaners had burned them. Members of the Steen Camp family had even hired a private investigator to try and help them, but they were drawing a blank too. A few workers in the area said they had seen a white Audi with a broken mirror speeding around. A few of them even said they believed there had been a crash involving this car. The team went back, but they found no broken mirror fragments near the alleged accident site, and this lead went nowhere. The farm attack was still on people's minds, but the police weren't so sure. Nothing of value had been taken, and there was no forced entry. Two big things that didn't make sense. The family also had 4 dogs which were found alive and well. Don had not mentioned hearing them barking at anything. And in a lot of farm attacks, experts said that dogs were often poisoned or subdued before these attacks took place. And it seemed clear that whoever the killer was, they knew the layout of the home, something a random intruder would not. Detectives also felt confident that they were looking for just one perpetrator. As the investigation continued, the family's funeral was held. Don sat in the front row with his grandparents giving hugs to everyone that walked past. Everybody was heartbroken for the 15-year-old. In a matter of minutes, he had lost his parents and sister in the most traumatic of ways, and his life was irreparably changed. Everyone said that Dion and Crystal adored their children, and they all had a comfortable and nice life, wanting for nothing. But despite their wealth, they were very humble and modest and never shied away from hard work, an important trait they wanted their children to have too. Dion's sister joked that Don was Crystal's favorite, but Martella was definitely a daddy's girl. People said that when they first met, Dion was such a big man with a big presence, he looked intimidating, but the moment you spoke to him, he was a teddy bear and a real softie. He coached under 18s teams in tent pegging, an equestrian sport that is popular in the area, was a church deacon, and was part of the farming union too. A proud man and someone very dedicated to his community. Crystal loved gardening and had recently started her own baking business. Don and Martella had both attended boarding school just over 200 miles away. But Dion and Crystal made sure they came home most weekends, driving there and back to drop them off and pick them up. They never minded the long drives though, because family time meant everything, and they didn't like being apart for weeks at a time. Teachers said Martella was a dream student and a total perfectionist with everything she did. Her school paid tribute to the 14-year-old as well. And the pain her friends and fellow students felt was clear to see. Another person who was trying to piece things together was Joe Schultz. He was in charge of rural safety in the farming union and was often a spokesperson if things like this happened. He unfortunately looked at and helped investigate many a farm attack. But he said in his experience what had happened to his neighbors and friends did not tick those same boxes. The police knew Schultz well, and he had been allowed into the house on the night of the murders. He said Martella's face was beaten and swollen, and she didn't even look like a person anymore, let alone someone he knew and had watched grow up. The attack was so violent he had never seen anything like it. Experts would later confirm that the same guns that Don had found outside and taken to the station with him were the murder weapons. But if he found the weapons 50 meters away outside, how could he have heard more shots coming from inside as he drove away? And if Don had been in the bar before the shootings happened, surely he would have seen or heard the killer coming in a space that vast and rural cars would be needed to get away, again making more noise and drawing more attention. Authorities already knew that Martella had fled outside to hide by the tree, a tree that was just a few steps away from the barn. How could Don not have heard her when he was so close? And if he had been trying to save his little sister like he had claimed, why would he talk about her blood repulsing him so much? Surely he wouldn't have been focused on that. Why would he spend time changing his clothes in a house that was under attack with a killer on the loose? Gunpowder residue tests done on 2 of Don's shirts recovered from the house came back as positive. All of this, along with the fact that there was no forced entry, no other DNA, the dogs hadn't reacted, and nothing had been stolen, meant just one thing. The attention was now firmly on the only surviving person from that night, 15-year-old Don Steen Camp. Was it possible that the same boy that had come running into the station hysterical had actually been the one to commit the crime? But why, they wondered. The rape of Martella presented this potential motive. Don had sexually assaulted his sister and then killed his family to cover it up when she threatened to expose him. And then there was the cell phone analysis. Data from Crystal's phone showed that she sent a text message to Martella at 6:34 p.m. Nothing serious, just a short message about an upcoming holiday. But this was crucial in terms of the timings. This meant that the murders had to have taken place after 6:34 p.m., and if Don was already at the station at 6:50 p.m., this would have meant someone breaking in and murdering everyone happened in just 16 minutes. This did not match Don's timeline, and he would have been unable to do everything he claimed he had done in this small window. They also found it's an impossible idea for the killer and Don to not have run into each other in those few minutes. And if he had actually heard more shots ringing out as he sped away, that would mean the killer was still in the house and would undoubtedly have crossed paths with Don as he was going in and out. They felt the only way you would feel safe to stay in the house long enough to change your clothes is if you knew no one dangerous was actually in there. Blood splatter analysis also did not link with his version of Martella grabbing his shirt as he tried to help her. In fact, the splatter pattern on his shirt proved that he had been close to her when the shots were fired. It would have looked totally different if it was a smear of blood or a transfer as he held her. An expert said that Martella would in all likelihood have been too weak to tear his shirt, so they felt confident that this had been torn as he attacked her and she tried to defend herself. Police felt it was possible, however, for Don to kill them all in several minutes, quickly change, throw the guns in the truck, then drive just a few minutes to the station. More texts from after the murders had also been analyzed. These were texts between Don and one of his friends. Who do they suspect? Only me. Are there no other fingerprints? No, only mine. Is there no other evidence to find someone else? No, they're not going to find anyone else. At this point, even Dion's sister said she suspected her nephew but couldn't quite fathom it. She said consoling him whilst also questioning his actions was surreal. She was still hoping she was wrong. On August 21, 2012, Dick Duvall arrived at Don's school with handcuffs. Detectives working the case said they had exhausted every other possible line of inquiry. They felt they had been as thorough as they could be before they presented their case. Even they didn't want to think that the 15-year-old son and brother could have done this to his own family. But after 4 months copious and time-consuming investigations, tests and expert opinions, they just could not draw any other conclusion. The now 16-year-old Don Steen Camp was placed under arrest in his head teacher's office. Don was walked through the school to the car with other students watching on. Don just stared ahead. He didn't seem angry or upset. He was blank. Duvall was driving to the station when a breaking news announcement came over the radio. A 16-year-old has been arrested for the murder of the Steen Camp family. Duvall said he discreetly glanced at him through the mirror to see his reaction. He said a slight smirk flickered across his face before he went back to staring into space. Don Steen Camp was charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of defeating the ends of justice. He would also later be charged with the rape of his sister Martella. He pleaded not guilty to all 5 charges. In early September, Don was granted bail so he could carry on with his schoolwork. People in the school said that Don had always been rather quiet and sometimes even slightly withdrawn. But after his family's murders, he was like a different person. He was chatty, confident to the point of arrogant, and loved the attention this was all bringing him, especially from girls. Teachers said it was a far cry from the teen just a couple of months ago. But while on bail, he was forced to drop out of school as some of the other parents were piecing things together and looking at him as a suspect. There were soon so many complaints about him being back in the school that his head teacher asked him to leave. So although his name and face were technically concealed, many people had long been talking and connecting the dots. A psychologist assessed Don during this time and said he had no history of aggression and exhibited no symptoms of having any kind of behavioral disorder or mental health issues. She said from talking to him, she didn't think anyone could have predicted this. Another psychologist added that Don showed good character, was respectful, had positive attributes, and formed good relationships with people. There were no red flags, so to speak. She said that in most cases where children kill their families or parents, it is because they are a victim of chronic abuse. Sources say that although Dion could be strict, from what they saw it was no more than most parents, and there was nothing to suggest any abuse was happening in the home. Don himself emphatically stated to one expert that his parents were never abusive towards him. In order for the trial to go ahead, legal fees had to be sorted out. In October 2013, the Northern Cape High Court agreed to release our $500,000 of inheritance bequeathed to Don so that the trial could start. The funds were released through the last will and testament of Don's grandfather. The court did not allow any funds that would have come from the estates of Dion and Crystal. In South Africa, the jury system in courts was abolished in 1969, so it was down to the Northern Cape Judge President Franz Gormel to make a decision on whether or not he was guilty. The media has been warned to toe the line. The judge threatened criminal charges if the accused is identified even to family and friends. Since his arrest, a court order had prevented Don's name from being released. Cameras were allowed in the courtroom, which is why we see him inside, but ones of his face were not published. And a lot of the time it was just the back of him that was shown to the media. As the trial started, things were thrown into question when police got an alleged confession from 3 sources: 2 women and a man. It was reported that one of the women, who was at the time already in custody for possession of explosives and ammunition, said that the Steen Camp murders were part of a plan to attack white farmers in an attempt to instill fear and incite racial hatred. But the police said there was absolutely no truth to this and not a shred of evidence that supported it. The prosecution felt that they had a strong case and they had almost 100 witnesses that they intended to call. They presented their motives and timelines. Don had raped his sister Martella and she had threatened to tell her parents. Don had shot them all to cover this up. And the fact that Martella was involved in a struggle prior to her death also supported the theory that the murders had something to do with her assault. The judge, experts, and police all felt sure that the person that had raped her was also her killer. And if she was assaulted 12 to 24 hours before she was killed, what were the chances that this happened and then the intruder came back a day later to kill everybody? Another motive was the fact that Don was set to inherit our $23,000,000, the equivalent of almost £1 million or $1,300,000 at the time. He also stood to get Martella's portion as well. A day after the killings, one of the first things he asked a psychologist was how his inheritance would be worked out, and said he knew all about his family's finances and what he was entitled to. Don did testify himself, and the judge said he showed himself to be a poor witness, and under cross-examination, his story was easily discredited. But even when he was caught out in a blatant lie, he seemed totally unfazed. One journalist said they kept looking for some form of emotion, but Don gave them nothing except being arrogant to the judge. On one of the days, everybody went down to the farm to get a clearer picture of where everything was. When the judge saw where Don had allegedly found the weapons, he commented that this made the killer the dumbest farm attacker in South Africa. To kill the family, run for the exit, drop the murder weapons, and then run back in. He added that if the only thing that was stolen was a knife, it must have been a diamond-encrusted one to have been worth taking over everything else in the house. But Don's defense team said in their eyes, it still pointed more towards an intruder than Don. They said that the only real theory they had as a motive was the rape, but they doubted whether this had even happened despite 2 doctors confirming it had. They even went as far to say that Martella could have caused the wounds and bruising in and around her genitals herself. They also pointed out that there was no semen found, but given that it was 12 to 24 hours later, the state said this didn't really prove anything. The analysis from the doctors was enough to prove it. After several weeks and a tough trial for the family to sit through, the judge returned his verdict. He found Don guilty of the premeditated murders of Dion, Crystal, and Martella, and the rape of Martella. He was also found guilty of defeating the ends of justice, also known as preventing justice or perverting the cause of justice. The judge said he was also totally convinced that this was not the first time that Martella was a victim of Don's sexual abuse. In his final statements, the judge said, I am satisfied that no one other than the minor accused committed all the offenses listed in the indictment, as the state has in fact proved them not only beyond a reasonable doubt, but beyond any shadow of a doubt. To deal with all aspects proved against the minor would amount to an overkill. The murders were not only premeditated, but were in fact planned and executed with the direct intent to murder. He added, in my view, the minor, the torturer, wanted to have sexual intercourse with Martella. When she refused, she was consequently tortured, raped, and murdered to prevent her from reporting it. Her parents had to be eliminated. There would be no reason for Martella to inform anyone of the sexual activity if a consensual love relationship existed between her and the accused. The truth is, he is the architect of his own misfortune. He is the one who raised the alarm with the police and cried wolf. During his sentencing, he told Don to face the consequences of his actions. 2 days later, Don turned 18, and with this, the order preventing his name from being released was lifted. People were stunned. But others that had questioned the crime scene in the first place, like Joe Skultz, said it sadly explained so much that they hadn't been able to explain any other way. When it came to the sentencing, a legal expert said that the South African justice system did not really give life sentences or sentences exceeding 20 years for children under the age of 18. The maximum sentence he would be facing was 25 years. Both rape and murder are classified as Schedule 6 offenses. However, when it comes to minors, it is entirely left to the discretion of a judge to decide on a suitable sentence. All sentences would run concurrently, making it 20 years in total. He reacted to nothing as the verdict was read out. Stony-faced, he hugged some family members goodbye before he was led away. The judge said that whatever happened to him after this was none of his concern. In line with the Correctional Services Act, he will serve at least half of the sentence before he can apply for parole, which is 10 years. This does not mean that he will get parole after those 10 years, just that he cannot apply before then. And 10 years will take us to 2024. His age at the time of the killings will not have any impact on future parole considerations because the judge already took that into consideration with his sentencing. Even if he qualified for parole after 10 years, there will still be other guidelines and regulations that could play a role, like inputs from family members, for example. He has also since been investigated in prison for breaking rules, and things like this will factor in too. Legal experts said if it wasn't for his age at the time, which constricted the judge in the sentence he could give, he might have been given a lifelong sentence. An appeal was filed, but Don needed to have his first legal bill settled from the trial and then find a team to take it on. People have always been split on what they believe, even his own family. His grandmother Betty said although she believed he was innocent for so long, the evidence against him was just too strong, and she had accepted that he was guilty, but that she also forgave him. She hoped that he could get the necessary psychiatric and psychological help so that one day he could make a positive contribution to society. Dion's sister Mariana said that she has to simply make peace with the outcome and accept it. Neighbors like Joe Skultz, who believe he is guilty, said if Don could admit that he did it and tell people why, it would give them the closure they all need, and they might be able to move forward, maybe even forgiving him one day. This brought an end to a truly unprecedented case that had been on everyone's mind for almost 2 years. Known to many as the Greek Wustad farm murders, it dominated the media for ages and left a lasting imprint on Northern Cape and further afield. Jacques Steen Camp, who was of no relation to the family, followed the trial and the family's journeys and wrote a best-selling book about the case, which was then made into a film in 2019. People likened that day in April to feeling like a horror movie in itself. Judge Franz Hormel later retired but was appointed inspecting judge of the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigations, also known as the Hawks. And sadly, in 2021, Dick Duvall, who had played such a vital part in bringing this case to a close, passed away after a short illness. It is safe to say that there will forever be so many unanswered questions about that day, and closure for the family left behind may always be so far away. Don has not spoken about that day but still denies having any part in it. So what actually happened on the farm on April 6, 2012 will likely never be known, and everyone will remain in the dark. One psychiatrist said that over time and with more assessments, a personality disorder or mental health issue might arise and show itself, which could give a clearer insight into his mind at the time. But there is also a good possibility that this will never happen. She said, whatever happened on that day is locked in his head, and if he hasn't said it yet, I don't think he'll ever say. I think the story was truly buried on that day. Mary Jamie Egan, lovingly nicknamed Bobo by all who knew her, was born on January 11, 1953. One of 5 siblings, she grew up in Magnolia, a small town in southwestern Arkansas with strong family roots. Her father, Gresham, was raised on a farm north of Magnolia, while her mother, Sue, hailed from Sparkman, about 60 miles away. Both attended college in Magnolia at the institution then known as Magnolia A&M, which later became Southern Arkansas University, where Bobo graduated in 1976. After college, Gresham pursued a career in real estate development, and in 1949, he and Sue co-founded Magnolia Lodging, their family business. Over the years, the couple developed more than 50 properties, primarily hotels and motels across Arkansas and Texas. Sue was deeply involved in community service and had a passion for the arts, particularly theater, serving on the Magnolia Arts Council. Bobo inherited traits from both her parents. From a young age, she was active in her community, starting as a Girl Scout, blending her parents' entrepreneurial spirit and dedication to civic engagement. In 2014, one of her classmates would write to the local paper to share the story of how Bobo responded to the integration of Magnolia schools. The classmate, who was American, recalled the uneasiness she felt coming into the previously all-white school and how Bobo's acceptance of and friendliness towards her new classmates inspired other students to behave in the same manner, making what could have been difficult transition much easier. Bobo loved the arts like her mother, but whereas Sue preferred the theater, Bobo had a passion for studio art. After graduating from college, she opened up a small art studio in Magnolia and began teaching art classes out of it. She also shared her father's interest in real estate and purchased a house on McNeil Street to refurbish and resell for profit. Rather than outsource most of labor the home needed, Bobo did it herself. On the morning of July 20th, 1978, 25-year-old Bobo went for a walk and then into her studio where she taught a morning art class. While the day started off normally, Bobo would not return home at her usual time. She still lived at her family home, and Mrs. Shin became worried when it was almost time for dinner, but Bobo had not made it back. She began calling around to Bobo's friends to see if they knew where she was. Bobo had taken an ad out in the local paper for the home she had renovated and was now trying to sell. Her friend Anita, whom she had met because she was dating a friend of Bobo's boyfriend, had called Bobo at her studio that morning. Anita was still a student at Southern Arkansas University and often spent time with Bobo in the afternoon after she was done with her classes and Bobo had finished teaching her lessons. Their favorite place to spend time that summer was the pool at the motel on Main Street Freshamshin had recently built. When Anita called Bobo at 11 a.m. that day to ask her to get together that afternoon, Bobo could not immediately commit to any plans. She was waiting to hear back from a man who was interested in potentially buying a home she had just renovated. She promised to call Anita back after she found out if she would be showing him the house that afternoon or not. Bobo called Anita back just a few minutes after hanging up from that first phone call. The prospective buyer had just called her back, and he had a house just outside of Magnolia he was interested in trading her house for. She was going to meet with him but hoped to be able to see Anita afterwards. "Come looking for me if I'm not back this afternoon," she joked before hanging up the phone. Mrs. Shin was also able to learn that the man her daughter was meeting was having his car serviced at the Pontiac dealership in town and had arranged for Bobo to pick him up at the Easy Mart across the street from it. No one seemed to know his name, however. Mrs. Shin decided to drive over to the dealership to see if they could provide her with any information about the man. She arrived at the dealership just as the employees were closing up for the day. They did not have any cars in for service that could have belonged to the still unidentified potential home buyer. One of the dealership employees was able to tell Mrs. Shin that he had seen a car that looked like Bobo's blue 1976 Buick pick up a man in the Easy Mart parking lot around noon that day. After sharing that information with Bobo's mother, the dealership employee then left to go home. His involvement in the search for Bobo was not over yet, however. As he drove down Main Street, he happened to see a blue Buick parked behind Smitty's grocery store. He pulled into the parking lot to see if anyone was around the vehicle. No one was. However, the scene inside the car was concerning. Bobo's white tennis shoes were on the floor by the pedals, and her sunglasses and a novel were thrown on the passenger seat. Her purse, wallet, and the keys to the car were still inside of it. The only thing that would be found to be missing Bobo's address book, which authorities would later speculate had been taken to prevent them from gathering any information about the man Bobo had her meeting with that day. The dealership employee immediately drove back to work to tell Mrs. Shin about what he found, and she in turn notified the police. A massive search for Bobo was carried out, and her family quickly offered a reward in the case. Originally, it was $10,000, but eventually, it grew to $25,000. Witnesses were able to help the police put together a timeline. Employees at Smitty's had noticed Bobo's car in the parking lot at 1:30 that afternoon. A witness at the Easy Mart had seen a dark-haired man come into the store to get change for the payphone around 11 a.m., just before Bobo received the call from the man who was interested in her investment property. After the story of Bobo's disappearance and photographs of her appeared in the local paper, the county tax assessor, Henry Irwin, came forward with a potential sighting of the vehicle. Mr. Irwin had been baling hay on his property on July 20th. Around noon, he saw a blue Buick traveling down the highway, weaving back and forth. It appeared to him that the man and woman inside the car were struggling as they drove. A carpenter had been working across the street from the house Bobo had been trying to sell. He came forward with a sighting of her on the day she disappeared, but this account has since been called into question. The carpenter said that he saw a woman he believed to be Bobo around 11:30 a.m. on the day Bobo went missing. Shortly after she arrived at the home, a man with brown hair and a mustache drove up in a dark green Pontiac. He and Bobo went inside the home and came back out after approximately 10 minutes. They then each got into their own cars and drove off in the same direction with the man following Bobo. The problem with the sighting is that it does not line up with where Bobo was planning to meet the man who was interested in trading houses with her. It is that she ended up meeting with the two men that day. The man the carpenter saw and the man seen getting changed for the payphone, who may or may not have been the man who spoke to Bobo on the phone in between her calls to Anita, were similar in appearance but appeared to be two different individuals. The man the carpenter saw had facial hair, whereas the one seen at the Easy Mart did not. It is possible that Bobo received another phone call from a second man interested in her property after she hung up her second phone call with Anita. However, the timeline will be very tight, especially given the fact that some reports say that Bobo went home to change clothes before going to meet with anyone about the property. It would only have taken about 5 minutes for her to drive from the Shen family home to the house on McNeil Street, but since she couldn't have left her studio before 11:15, it would have been difficult for her to meet someone at the investment property by 11:30. It is not impossible, however, and even with this potential second meeting, she would have had enough time to get to the Easy Mart to pick up the man as the dealership employee had witnessed. If Henry Irwin's timing is correct, and it was Bobo's car he saw swerving down the highway, then it appears this man attacked Bobo straight away, never going to the home on McNeil Street with her. Seeds and grasses had been found all along the bottom of Bobo's car, as though it had been through a field. Given the fact that Bobo's car had been seen driving at noon and was abandoned at the grocery store by 1:30, the car could not have been driven very far away in that limited amount of time, which in theory narrowed down the search area. Even if the car Henry Irwin had witnessed at noon was not actually Bobo's, the time frame is still not widened by very much, as Bobo was still at her art studio until after 11 that morning. Despite the extensive searches and manpower dedicated to the investigation, Bobo has never been found. The investigator most closely tied to the case is Mike Lowe. Lowe had been with state police for just 10 months when Bobo went missing. While he was not immediately assigned to the case, he was immediately connected to it. His hometown was not far from Magnolia, and he was a graduate of Southern Arkansas University. While he was a student there, Bobo Shin had sat in front of him in one of his history classes. While he and Bobo were no more than casual acquaintances, he was still shocked to see her familiar face in the newspaper alongside an article about her disappearance. The following May, Lowe was sent to Magnolia to serve as the lead investigator for the state police there, allowing him to work on his former classmate's case, which the other investigators in town are still working as thoroughly as they were when Bobo first went missing. The carpenter who had been working across McNeil Street from the home Bobo was trying to sell or trade had helped develop a composite sketch of the man he said he saw with Bobo the day she disappeared. A considerable amount of time and resources had been put into distributing the sketch and interviewing men who resembled it during the first several months of the investigation. However, by the time Mike Lowe joined the investigation, the investigators who had been working on it since July were to believe that the composite sketch was actually of a man who lived several houses down from the home Bobo owned and was unrelated to the case. Mike Lowe shared their concerns. While law enforcement's desire to close the case never waned, they eventually began running out of new avenues of investigation. While the Shin family appreciated all of their work, eventually presenting Mike Lowe with a piece of Bobo's artwork in appreciation for all of his efforts, they were desperate to have all possible resources focused on finding Bobo, and so they also hired private investigators to work on the case as well. While authorities believed that it was most likely that Bobo had been killed by the man who called her about her investment property on the day she went missing. In October of 1979, her family was still hopeful that she was somehow still alive, even though more than a year had gone by without any sort of ransom demand. They had already gone through 2 private investigators, and that month, they reached out to the third and most controversial investigator they would hire. William Dear was a Texas-based private investigator who had recently garnered national attention for finding James Dallas Egbert III and returning him to his family. Gresham Shin hoped that Dear could likewise help reunite his family with Bobo. While Dear did not believe that Bobo was still alive, he nevertheless took on the case. After arriving in Magnolia, Dear performed his own interviews and carried out his own searches. In part, due to the composite sketch based on the carpenter's account, Dear eventually focused his investigation on a man from next county over, Michael Morse. Morse had taken his own life several months after Bobo went missing. He resembled the sketch, and the carpenter claimed, based on a photo, that he was the man he had seen. Because of his resemblance to the sketch, Morse had been interviewed by the authorities within a week of Bobo going missing. When Dear interviewed Morse's boss, he said that he had taken July 20th, 1978 off to go meet with someone about real estate. Dear claimed that a psychic called him on the phone and told him that Morse had buried Bobo's body on top of his own father's coffin. On November 20th, 1979, Dewey Morse's grave in the Western Cemetery next to Missionary Baptist Church was exhumed, but no extra body was found in the grave. Despite this setback, Dear publicly announced that he would solve the case within the next 2 weeks. This, of course, did go over well with the authorities who had been working on the case for over a year, who did not appreciate his arrogance. While the Morse family did consent to the exhumation of Dewey Morse's grave, they filed a $2 million lawsuit against William Dear less than a month after it occurred. Sam Tatum, who had been the head of the State Crime Commission at the time, was also initially named in the lawsuit but was later dropped from it. Michael Morse's widow, Norma, and his mother, Corinne, sued for emotional distress and invasion of privacy. They claimed that Dear had engaged in extreme and outrageous conduct in publicly accusing Michael Morse of abducting and killing Bobo, using information received from a so-called psychic and through other similar bizarre sources. Dear would later say that the tip that led to him exhuming the grave had not actually come from a psychic. He had made up the story about a psychic calling him with the information in order to protect an informant. In June of 1981, a civil jury ruled in Dear's favor in the lawsuit. While Dear has long since been off of Bobo's case officially, when reporter Paul McDonald interviewed him in 2016, he said he was still investigating it on his own. He claimed that he had recently heard from a new informant who had passed a polygraph. He could not name the informant out of concerns for his safety because he was implicating someone who was still alive. The informant believed that Bobo was buried on a specific piece of property just outside of Magnolia. Dear says he emailed Mike Lowe with this information but was asked to relay it to the county prosecutor. Not trusting the prosecutor to follow up on the information, Dear decided to finance a search of the property himself. As of the publication of McDonald's article on Bobo's case in March of 2016, he was still working to secure the necessary permissions to do so, and it does not appear as though the search has since been carried out. In the decades following Bobo's disappearance, Mike Lowe has performed more searches and followed up on leads all over the state of Arkansas and the southern United States. The intensity of his focus on the case has not diminished despite the passage of time. In 2010, he retired from the Arkansas State Police. He then ran for and was elected sheriff of Columbia County and continued his investigation into Bobo's disappearance in his new role. In January of 2015, Sheriff Lowe worked with a team of 3 other investigators to revamp the investigation. They looked at all of the evidence again and re-interviewed witnesses. The information was organized into a new file that Lowe submitted to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. He has also resubmitted evidence for more sophisticated testing than was available in 1978. So far, these efforts have not resolved the case. Both of Bobo's parents passed away without ever learning what happened to their daughter, her father in 1986 and her mother in 2012. In 2014, her brother and 3 sisters decided they wanted to celebrate Bobo's life despite the lack of information about exactly how it ended. On 19th, the family gathered in the Memorial Park Cemetery to dedicate a headstone for Bobo next to the plot shared by her parents where they hoped to one day lay her to rest. Later that day, the family and the community gathered for a memorial service for Bobo at Central Baptist Church in Magnolia. The service featured multiple musical performances, memories, and speeches, one of which was given by Dr. John Stubblefield, who had served as pastor of the church in 1978 and knew Bobo. For those who are perpetrators of evil, be sure that your sin will find you out. Not that God will find out about your sin, He knows it, but the sin will be exposed. He said at the service, "It is my hope and prayer that someone even at this date might come forward and share something that would help bring closure to this family." This case takes us to Kingston upon Hull, England. For many, December 31st is a time to bid farewell to the year with excitement, celebrate with loved ones, and reflect on hopes for the year ahead. 21 years ago, on Tuesday, December 31st, 2002, this tradition was no different. Across the UK, people were preparing to welcome the new year with festivities. 21-year-old Rachel Moran was among them. She headed out to a pub to enjoy the evening with her brother John and some friends. Rachel was very close to her family and planned to spend the night at her parents' house on Hall Road. After an evening of drinking and fun, Rachel and John returned to their parents' home around 1:15 a.m. Wanda, Rachel's mother, was still awake, reading when they arrived. While John went straight to bed, Rachel stayed up to chat with her mom. Wanda suggested that Rachel call her boyfriend Mark to wish him a happy new year. Mark was supposed to be at their shared home, taking care of their kittens. Rachel tried calling him on the house phone, but the call went unanswered. She then tried his mobile, but when someone finally picked up, it wasn't Mark. It was a mutual friend. Rachel could hear a party going on in the background, and it turned out he had been invited to a house party and agreed to go. Rachel wasn't happy and was frustrated because it meant that the kittens had been left alone. Then Mark's phone ran out of credit, and she could no longer get through. As Rachel disappeared off, Wanda assumed she was going to bed, but Rachel soon reappeared, changed her shoes and headed for the front door, telling her mom goodbye. Wanda went after her, and as she went outside, she asked her where she was going. Rachel replied that she was going home to be with the kittens and make sure they were okay. The weather was horrible and cold, and Wanda was concerned for her daughter. There were very few taxis due to it being New Year's Eve, and Wanda didn't really want her daughter walking home in the dark by herself. As they stood outside talking, a man walked past them, and Wanda was so concerned she nearly called out to him and asked him to walk with Rachel and make sure she was safe, but she chose not to. Despite her mother's protests, Rachel set off and began the walk back to her flat. Wanda called out to her and told her to ring as soon as she got home. Rachel replied that she would. 30 minutes had soon passed. There had been no call from Rachel. Wanda continued to call Rachel's mobile repeatedly, but she wasn't answering. Her home phone also went unanswered. Wanda tried to think about where she could be. Maybe she had gone out looking for Mark, but the time continued to tick by, and it had now been 2 hours since Rachel had left, and there was still no word from or sign of her. Wanda was exhausted and decided to go to bed, hoping that in the morning she would hear from Rachel and that everything was okay. As daylight broke, Wanda's phone rang. She got out of bed and ran downstairs as relief washed over her, hoping it was her daughter. But it wasn't. It was Vanda, her other daughter and Rachel's sister, calling her mom to wish her a happy new year. Wanda spoke to her son John and her husband Ray and told them that Rachel had gone home in the early hours of the morning and failed to get in touch. John tried ringing Rachel's mobile phone, but he too was met with silence, and the calls wouldn't connect. As he tried calling her house phone, there was a glimmer of hope. The phone was engaged, meaning there was someone there using the phone. Wanda called back 5 minutes later, and the call connected and was answered. It was Mark. Wanda asked him if Rachel was there. "No, she's not here. She was staying with you last night, wasn't she?" Mark told Wanda he had been out all night and got back to the flat at around 7 that morning and gone straight to bed. The flat was as he had left it. The kittens hadn't been fed, and there was nothing to suggest that Rachel had been back at all. Wanda and John immediately went over to the flat, and Mark was right. She definitely had not made it back. This was so out of character for Rachel, and Wanda knew that something was very wrong with the whole situation. Mark tried to calm her fears and said that Rachel knew many people and could have gone to someone's house. It hadn't even been 12 hours yet. But Wanda was not convinced. She knew that Rachel would have called her as soon as she got home. And if she wasn't at home, where was she? Rachel Moran was the youngest of 4, born in Ireland to parents Wanda and Ray. She had 3 siblings, her brother John and 2 sisters, Vanda and Carrie. Her father called her the baby of the family. As a child, she had wanted to become a vet, but when she got older, she changed her mind and became a worker in a creche, looking after babies. It was a job she adored. Rachel was a very striking woman and stood at 6 feet tall. She was someone who enjoyed life and saw the good in everyone she met. She had been an entertainment and cabaret student at Hall College, and although she was well known and sociable, she was more shy with those she didn't know. It was also at Hall College that she met Mark Shepard in 2001, and a romance soon blossomed. They lived in a 1-bedroom, first-floor flat on the Orchard Park estate. Orchard Park is a quiet suburb of Kingston upon Hull, and as Rachel was incredibly close to her family and a real home bird, she wanted to be as close to them as possible. When she moved in with Mark, she ended up living less than a mile away from them. She wanted new challenges, and as she thought more about what she wanted to do, she decided that in the new year, she was going to go back to college and study catering with the hopes of becoming a chef. As the holiday season approached, Rachel and Mark got 2 kittens, named Speedy Tomato and Batman. Rachel doted on them. Knowing that the festive period was going to be a busy one, Rachel and Mark made a plan to ensure that the kittens were regularly checked on. They decided that while Mark went to see his mother for Christmas, she would stay in the flat with the kittens. Then when he came back, Rachel would go out on New Year's Eve and Mark would stay with them. But after she had walked home to feed them, after learning Mark was at a party, Rachel was now missing. For her to fail to contact her family after promising she would was very unusual, and with there being no evidence that she had even made it home, her brother and mother went straight to the police station on Priory Road and reported Rachel as missing. Detective Superintendent Paul Davison was leading the investigation, and he later explained that the first thing that is looked at are the circumstances. Was this something people would expect Rachel to do? Was this something she had done before? No, it wasn't. Trevor Watts, who also worked for homicide police, said it was clear that there was something seriously wrong. The police acted quickly and began their search for her. More than 40 officers were part of the initial investigation into what had happened to Rachel. Her family came in and gave witness statements. Wanda mentioned to the police someone who could be a witness, the man who had walked past them on the street. Detectives began trying to find this person, and as they did, they also spoke to Mark. They knew that there had been an argument between him and Rachel, and it was vital to ascertain whether or not Mark could possibly be involved. Paul Davison said that Mark did not appear to be that worried or upset, which did strike them as strange. Mark was then put under surveillance and his alibi was looked at too. But the surveillance turned up nothing, as Mark did nothing out of the ordinary, and nothing to arouse suspicion either. His alibi also checked out. He had nothing to do with Rachel's disappearance. This meant they were not only back at square one, but also that the worst fears of everyone were now seeming more likely. She had potentially come to harm at the hands of a stranger. Stranger abductions are thankfully very rare, but this was something they had to consider. Her bank account had not had any money withdrawn. Her mobile phone hadn't made any calls or sent any texts. None of her clothes were missing from her flat. The police began looking at the network of CCTV cameras in the area to see if they could find Rachel on the night of her disappearance. And they did. CCTV cameras picked her up passing a place called Jackson's on Hall Road. This gave police not only a timestamp of her movements that night, but also showed the direction she was walking in, meaning they had a much more specific place to focus their search efforts and investigation. All available resources were now being used in the search for Rachel. Police helicopters were deployed, the dogs were also out with their handlers, and police on horseback were used too. The homicide police diving team were drafted in to join the search, and all of this was deeply painful for Rachel's family, seeing how serious this now was. The media coverage was intense, and many appeals were put out for any information. Rachel was described in these appeals as being more like a teenager than a young woman in her 20s, as her family begged for any news of her whereabouts. Saturday, January 11th, 2003. The divers were searching the Barnstone Drain. This was a canal that was often used by people to dump rubbish in, and it was here that they found their first clue. A Nike trainer, very similar to the one that Rachel had changed into at her mother's house. The divers continued to search, carefully removing rubbish layer by layer and going through everything thoroughly. And the next day, the Barnstone Drain would reveal more. A handbag was found in a bin bag. It was carefully removed and examined, and inside the handbag they found a mobile phone and makeup. One item revealed who the owner of the bag was, an Irish passport belonging to Rachel Moran. The handbag and the items within it had clearly been discarded in such a way as to ensure that it wasn't found. It hadn't been accidentally dropped in there. It was now looking more and more likely that this was a case of foul play. To try and generate new leads, the police conducted a reconstruction of Rachel's last known movements. A police officer who looked like Rachel wore the same outfit she had been in and walked the route she had taken. They hoped that this would jog someone's memory who had possibly seen her or something of note that night. This did cause several people to come forward, but because of it being New Year's Eve, alcohol had caused their recollections to be a bit blurred or hazy. The appeal did give police access to new CCTV footage taken from a local school. The footage was very poor quality, but a figure could be made out in the top left corner of the screen, and it was the officer's belief that this was Rachel. If this was indeed her, this meant she would have been less than 200 meters from the safety of her flat. This also meant that if it was her, she had taken a route that was slightly different to the one they had first believed she had walked. They initially thought she had taken a route that was well lit, but if this was her on the footage, she had actually taken a route that was a lot darker. As the footage continued to play, they noticed something else. There was a figure running up behind Rachel. If she had vanished from around this point, maybe this person was responsible. This footage now meant that the police had an area to focus on, and as Officer Trevor Watts explained, 99% of bodies are found within 1 mile of the last sighting of the person. It was decided that every single home within 1.5 miles of Rachel's was to be searched. More than 100 officers were drafted in, and it became the biggest search ever undertaken by homicide police. It was an enormous risk for the force. The sheer amount of time and manpower needed to thoroughly search every property was enormous. But if there was a chance, no matter how small, that they were going to find Rachel, it was a risk they needed to take. Tuesday, January 28, 2003. The search of the houses began. Each search team was made up of 3 people, a search specialist and 2 police officers. And as more and more houses were searched, Paul Davison received a call in the incident room. The caller was a police officer. He was deeply upset and distressed. The news that came through was shocking. PC Steve Dennison and his team had conducted a search of 19 Nash Court. The owner was a young man and he had a friend, another male, who was visiting. The flat was dirty and unclean, with rubbish strewn about the place. The search of the property was quick, and the owner assisted the officers by showing them each room. There was no sign of Rachel. There was one last thing for them to look at, the bin cupboard that was part of the apartment block and belonged to number 19. They asked the owner for the key. He said he didn't have one. Then he said he didn't know where it was, and then changed his story again and said that the key was maybe at his mom's. The officers found it odd. Why would he not have a key to a cupboard that was regularly used and a cupboard that was part of his property? The officers weren't budging. They needed to search it. They told him to find the key and find it quickly. He soon did. He handed it to the officer and went back into his flat. The door was finally opened. It was full of rubbish, including a carpet and boxes. They began to remove everything from the cupboard, and when PC Dennison turned back to remove more, he noticed that his colleague was just looking into the cupboard and not moving. As PC Dennison moved to see what his colleague was looking at, he saw a human leg in amongst the rubbish. After 4 weeks of searching, the hunt for Rachel Moran had ended. Her decomposing remains were found stuffed into the 3-foot by 3-foot cupboard, wrapped in a sheet, and barricaded behind the bags of rubbish. The flat she was found in was just 200 yards from her home. Both men were immediately arrested on suspicion of the murder of Rachel Moran. The owner of the flat was 23-year-old Michael Little. His friend was named Mark Fuller, and Mark immediately jumped up and protested that he had no idea what the officers were talking about. Michael told them that his friend knew nothing about it. Transport arrived to take Mark to the police station, and PC Steve Dennison was left in the flat with Michael Little. Michael Little then began to talk, and PC Dennison wrote down the following words in his notebook. Michael said, "I'm so glad you found her. I've wanted to tell someone for ages. It's such a weight off my chest. I saw the police stuff on the news and just hoped they came here. I've not told anybody else. Nobody knows. I can't be a normal person doing this. I must be evil or something. I saw her that night walking alone, so I went over and spoke to her. She came back here for a drink and we chatted for a while but ended up arguing. I think I walked out of the room or something, and when I came back, she'd gone into the kitchen and was stood at the side with her back to me. When I went near her, she turned around and I saw a small knife in her hand. She slashed out and cut me on my arm." He said he had killed her in self-defense. Wanda said she was relieved that her daughter had been found and that they wouldn't be left wandering. Michael Little was taken to Queens Garden Police Station and booked in. In his interview, PC Steve Dennison showed Michael the transcript he had taken at the flat, Michael's confession that he had killed her in self-defense. Michael said that the transcript was accurate and was what he had said, and he signed it to state as such. The police needed to piece together his movements for New Year's Eve. He had gone out with friends and attempted to talk to a woman that he had a crush on, but when she had rejected him and left with one of his friends, he then ran into someone else he knew and was invited to a party. He agreed to go. He stayed at the party until just after 12 and then decided to go home. When the officers looked at his route, they realized something incredibly sinister. He had been the man who had walked past Rachel and Wanda as she was getting ready to go back. He was the man that Wanda had nearly called out to and asked him to walk with her daughter and keep her safe. It was possible that he had heard Rachel saying she was going to walk home. When looking at the CCTV footage from outside of Jackson's on Hall Road, a male was seen 3 minutes before Rachel came into view. It was none other than Michael Little. The person who was seen in the footage taken from the school running up to Rachel from behind was now believed to be Michael as well. As he had previously been ahead of her, this meant he had likely hidden to allow her to walk past and then set off after her. The post-mortem results soon came through and painted a picture of an incredibly violent death. Rachel had been stabbed 27 times in the back, head, and neck after being attacked from behind with a 12-inch kitchen knife, which was never found. She had no defensive wounds. Several of the stab wounds were so forceful, they had gone through the back of her body and come out the other side. Rachel's blood was in the flat and suggested that she had been killed in the hallway. There was mud on the back of her legs, which Paul Davison said was evidence that she had been dragged across the grass into his flat. There was no evidence to suggest that she had attacked him. Although we can never be sure about what exactly happened that night, detectives believe he may have tried to talk to her as she walked, and that she had made it very clear that she wasn't interested in his advances. This would have been the second time he had been turned down that night, and in a fit of rage, he had abducted her and taken her into his flat before killing her. Swabs were taken which also showed she had been raped. The decision was made not to arrest Michael on suspicion of rape, as they could not be sure if she was alive or deceased when it happened. The block of flats that Rachel had lived in was opposite a children's playground, and on the other side of the playground was Michael's flat. The route she always took to her parents went directly in front of his window, where he would often sit, staring or drawing for hours on end. It is believed he had likely seen her walking past the window before. He had few friends, but officers did speak to the ones he had, and they spoke about his fantasizing about women and his claims that he had a girlfriend, something they knew wasn't true. When they described the alleged girlfriend he claimed to have, Michael had said she was a slim woman, standing at 6 foot with blonde hair, details that matched Rachel. Despite what he had said in his flat, his story soon changed. He said that Rachel had approached him and asked to walk with him to feel safer. After going to his flat, he claimed that an argument had broken out between the two of them, and he had hit her across the face with the back of his hand. He told an officer, "I lost it. I picked up a knife and stabbed her. I want some help to speak to a counselor or something." The amount of evidence they had just didn't fit with his story about this being an argument or that she had attacked him. The police weren't buying it. As for the other person in custody, Mark Fuller, he was released without charge, as it was determined he had absolutely nothing to do with Rachel's death. The question on everyone's minds was, who was Michael Little? He attended Great Field Comprehensive School in Hull, where he was frequently targeted by bullies because of his weight and was called Podgy by his fellow students. He mainly hung around with his sister at school, who was 4 years younger than him. His father had abandoned the family, and Michael said he was beaten and abused by his stepfather, who would later pass away as a result of kidney disease. Michael adored his mother, and she, along with his sister, were the only women in his life. As he grew into adulthood, he lived in various council flats that he would neglect and never clean. Neighbors often thought of him as strange, and he would use most of his time to stay inside, take drugs, and watch pornography. One person who went to school with him said that he would often take drugs, which made him unpredictable, saying, "There's always been something wrong with him. He has a pretty bad temper." Friday, January 31st, 2003. 23-year-old Michael Little was charged with the murder of Rachel Moran. He entered a plea of not guilty, meaning this would go to trial. At Hull Crown Court, Michael Little stood in the box, and the trial for Rachel's murder began. The evidence was substantial, and people were left wondering what kind of defense he could possibly put up. It was here his story changed again. He said that Rachel had agreed to have sex with him back at his flat, and that her murder had actually been committed by his friend, Mark Fuller. He said that in a fit of rage and jealousy after discovering Michael having sex with her, Mark had taken her life. He told the jury that Mark had gone, in his words, absolutely crazy, using a carving knife to kill her. He said that Mark had threatened to kill him and his family if he didn't take responsibility for Rachel's murder. Michael told the court that he regretted not doing more to help her during the attack, and claimed that he had been forced to clean up, get rid of the blood, and hide her body. I told him I was not going to help him, and he said I had no choice. I was extremely traumatized. I just didn't want to know. I just wished everything would go back to the way it was, he told the jury. On the witness stand, Mark was interrogated and quizzed in a brutal series of questioning. He denied playing any part in the murder of Rachel. He told the court he had gone to a party in the city before going to his mother's house in the early hours of the morning on the day Rachel had been killed. Mark was not charged with any offense by the police, there was no evidence linking him to it, and he had an alibi. This story was nothing more than a desperate attempt by Michael to pin the blame on someone else. Prosecutor Jeffrey Mason QC called Michael's story a pack of lies and said that it did not stack up to the strong evidence presented. When the details of her injuries and what she had suffered were read to the court, members of her family left the public gallery in tears. The prosecution presented all the evidence, Michael making several excuses as to why he didn't have a key to the cupboard, the CCTV, her handbag being disposed of, her blood in his flat, the lack of any injuries on Michael, and the inconsistencies in his stories. It was a very strong case. But was it enough? The jury would deliberate for 9 hours following the 3-week trial. The longer the jury were out, the more worried the police were looking, said Rachel's father, Ray. Detective Superintendent Paul Davison added that he feared he would be found not guilty the longer the jury were taking. Wanda had attended the entirety of the trial, but could not go into the courtroom for the verdict. As silence fell on the courtroom, the verdict was read. Michael's defense had not swayed the jury. He was convicted of murder. Michael Little showed no emotion. The hard work and dedication of the police had finally brought her killer to justice. Paul Davison said, "If we had not found the body, Rachel's grave would have been that 3-foot square cupboard." Before the sentencing, a letter written by Wanda was read to the court. She referred to herself as being a physical wreck in the wake of her daughter's murder and said that her husband Ray, Rachel's father, had been left destroyed. "For my husband Ray, it has destroyed him, and at times he has felt he has had nothing to live for. The loss of Rachel has severely traumatized my family. Life will never be the same again. We have not just lost Rachel, but lost part of each other." When her family came out of court, Rachel's older sister Carrie said, "We feel no elation, only emptiness." Her boyfriend, Mark, said in a statement, "My biggest regret is that Rachel was taken from me, and I didn't get the chance to say goodbye. I still can't and don't believe that Rachel has gone. Mr. Justice Hooper said that his attempt to blame an innocent man for Rachel's murder showed that Michael Little had a lack of concern for the truth and a total lack of remorse. He added that Rachel's murder had been totally destructive to her family and said that he would write to the Home Secretary and make the recommendation that a minimum tariff be set for his life sentence. In 2007, High Court Judge Mr. Justice Beatson set Michael Little's minimum term at 25 years. In 2010, it was reported that Rachel's sister, Vanda, had passed away following complications from chickenpox exposure. Due to complications from diabetes, she had lost both of her legs and was partially blind. Ray and Wanda said she had never, ever recovered from Rachel's death. They believed that she had neglected treatment from the moment it was discovered that Rachel had disappeared, until Michael Little was convicted 10 months later. Ray said he took away part of Vanda on that New Year's morning, that full year I put down to Michael Little. Vanda was later buried next to her sister. Detective Superintendent Paul Davison, who had led the investigation into Rachel's disappearance, retired from the police force in 2012 after reaching the rank of chief superintendent following 30 years in the job. New Year's Eve is for many an evening to look forward to. It's a chance to be with those nearest and dearest and look forward to whatever awaits in the coming year. This was no different for Rachel. She was someone whose life was just beginning, and it was clearly filled with so much promise. Detective Superintendent Paul Davison later wrote a book about her case, simply titled Rachel. It was published with the blessing of Wanda and Ray. He remained in contact with them and spoke of their strength in dealing with such a loss. They are incredible people. During the investigation, I got a glimpse of the impact losing Rachel had on them, of that gut-wrenching sense of loss. Every second is like a lifetime of pain for them, and it's never going to end. They have shown such incredible fortitude and strength throughout. 18-year-old Gail Schultz had a compassionate spirit and a passion for the arts. She loved playing the ukulele, writing poetry, and creating visual art, from sketching portraits to painting watercolors. After graduating from Nazareth High School in 1952, she chose not to pursue college or a job. Instead, she stayed home to help care for and teach her younger brother, Paul Jr., affectionately known as Butchie. Butchie, 12 years old, was Gail's half-brother. Gail's mother had passed away when she was very young, and her father, Paul Sr., later remarried a woman named Claire. Claire, who became Gail's stepmother, treated her as if she were her own daughter, and Gail adored Butchie, showing him boundless love despite their differing parentage. Butchie was unable to attend school, with recent reports suggesting he may have had autism. However, the exact nature of his condition remains unclear, as developmental delays were poorly understood and rarely diagnosed accurately during that time. In the 1950s, special education was largely unavailable, and since Butchie could not attend standard classes, he could not go to school. Gail was convinced that he could still learn, and in addition to taking care of Butchie, she did her best to educate him as well. One of Gail and Paul's favorite things to do was walk along Black Rock Creek, which rained behind their house on Mitchell Avenue in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. The family had only lived in the home for about a year and had moved into it because their previous home, more centrally located in Nazareth, did not have very much outdoor space for Butchie to play. Gail and Butchie liked to collect rocks, and Gail would challenge Butchie to try to find the shiniest rock along the creek. On Saturday, March 7, 1953, they left home around 2 in the afternoon to go out to the creek. They first stopped at a friend's house to ask if he wanted to join them, but he could not because his father had asked him to clean their basement. Gail and Butchie then went on to the creek without him. Multiple people would later report the two of them at the creek, but no one would see what happened to them next. Claire Schultz became concerned that her children had not yet come back inside within a few hours. Gail and Butchie would normally have already been back inside to warm up and get ready for dinner. Paul Schultz Sr.'s main career was working as a draftsman at Binney & Clark, a crayon manufacturer in the nearby city of Easton. However, he also repaired televisions and radios as a side business out of a workshop he maintained in the basement of his family's home. That day, he and an assistant, Robert Howells, were working on a television in the workshop. Around 5:20 p.m., Claire called down to him and asked him to go outside to call Gail and Butchie home. Paul then went outside, but received no answer when he called out to his children. He then walked closer to the creek, which was only a few 100 feet away from the house, to look for them. Robert Howells began packing up his tools when Paul went out to look for Gail and Butchie and was taking them out to his car when he heard Paul scream. When he looked to the creek, he saw Paul pulling Butchie from the water. Claire was in the kitchen at the time, looking out the window and watched as her husband pulled her son out of the creek. Paul had discovered both of his children, face down in the 10 inches of water in the creek. Gail and Butchie's autopsy would later estimate their time of death as 2:30 p.m., not long after they left home. But Paul would later say that his mind could not comprehend the possibility that his children were dead when he first found them. He immediately began trying to resuscitate them. Robert Howells had run into the house and called both the family doctor and the local ambulance for help. The crew of the ambulance also tried to revive the siblings and transported them to the Nazareth Fire Company for further medical assistance. Even after Gail and Butchie were finally declared dead, no one yet realized the manner of their deaths. It was assumed that Gail and Butchie had both died as the result of an accident, slipping, hitting their heads, and falling into the creek where they drowned. This was not an outrageous assumption. The rocks near the creek would be slippery under normal conditions, and the temperature had been just below freezing for much of the day, making ice a potential risk as well. Gail and Butchie were therefore taken from the fire company to a funeral home in Easton rather than to the coroner. However, when the funeral director began preparing their bodies, he realized that the head wounds Gail and Butchie had sustained were too extensive to have been caused by a simple fall. He recognized that the bodies would require full autopsies, and the police were finally notified of the siblings' deaths. At the autopsies the following day, it was determined that Butchie had been struck in the head 3 times and Gail had been struck 7 times. She also had a compound fracture on her thumb, which was believed to have been a defensive injury. The blows appeared to have come from a hammer. Both siblings had water in their lungs, indicating that they had still been alive and breathing after they were put into the creek. The police investigation into the murders faced numerous challenges. Authorities were not notified about the crime until 9:40 p.m., more than 7 hours after the murders occurred and 4 hours after the bodies were discovered. They could not properly search the crime scene because it was dark by the time they were called in, and several inches of snow fell in the early hours of the following morning. Gail's glasses were eventually found 40 feet away from where her body had been discovered in the creek, but not until 9 days after she died, after the snow began to melt. A chisel with a plastic handle was also eventually found at the scene, but forensic tests showed it would not have caused injuries consistent with those found on the siblings' heads. The crime scene was also highly contaminated. The ambulance and the doctor's vehicle had been driven back to the creek, and dozens of neighbors had come out to the scene after Gail and Butchie were found. Gail and Butchie's distraught parents had to be investigated as a matter of protocol. They were interviewed at least 3 times in the days following the murders and were given lie detector tests. Claire and Paul were cleared of involvement. There do not appear to have been any insurance policies on the siblings, but Gail was the beneficiary of a $17,000 trust established by her maternal grandmother, Minnie Romilly, which was to eventually be paid out to her in 3 separate payments. However, the trust specified that should Gail die, the payments would instead go to Zion Lutheran Church in Easton, meaning that there would be no financial motive to kill her at the time of her murder. Police theorized early on in the investigation that Gail and Butchie had been killed by what they described as a sex maniac, although there was no evidence suggesting a sexual motive. Gail and Butchie's cousin, Barry Ale, has theorized that his cousins may have instead been killed by someone who was upset by Butchie's behavior. Butchie did not speak in the way most people do, communicating in moans, screams, and grunts rather than typical speech. Someone who did not understand that Butchie had special needs could have been angered by the exaggerated noise he tended to make. Barry Isle had been just 9 years old at the time of his cousin's murders and had frequently gone down to the creek with the 2 of them. They had seen a homeless man near the creek the week before Butchie and Gail were killed, and Barry has speculated that this man may have been involved in the murders, but this remains just a theory. There was a lot of public interest in the case, which helped keep the investigation active. Tips were called in about suspicious individuals and unfamiliar cars in the area at the time of the murders, but none of the tips panned out. Various groups and businesses donated money to create a large reward for information, and the local newspaper hired a private and a criminologist to help with the investigation. Despite all the efforts from the police, the family, and the community, Gail and Butchie's case went cold. Paul Skelt Sr. died of a heart attack a year and a half after his children were killed in September of 1954. Claire Schultz then moved to Buffalo, New York to live near her son from a previous marriage, but was buried near Paul, Butchie, and Gail in Pennsylvania after her death in 1970. While little progress was made in the case in the ensuing decades, Gail and Butchie's memory has lived on in Nazareth. In 2011, classmates of Gail's and other alumni of Nazareth High School raised more than $2,000 to purchase a monument for Gail and Butchie. It was placed near the stadium on the campus of the larger Nazareth area high school, which was built the year after their deaths. In 2013, several of Gail's classmates worked with her cousin, Barry Ale, to compile a scrapbook of memorabilia about Gail. The 50-page scrapbook contains newspaper clippings about her death, but all of the scrapbook contains newspaper clippings about her death, but also many of her art pieces and articles she had written for her high school literary magazine. It is being housed in the library of Nazareth Area High School, and plans are made to digitize the materials so that a DVD could be produced and sent to every school in the district, as well as the local public library. The Pennsylvania State Police maintains a file with over 400 pages of information about Gail and Butchie's case and periodically hears from the public about it. But they have not made much progress in solving it in several decades. Timothy Alioth was a decorated Vietnam War veteran who served in the United States Marines from 1967 to 1973. His time spent serving along the DMZ left him with post-traumatic stress disorder, which eventually led to him becoming a completely disabled veteran. In February of 2009, 59-year-old Timothy was living with his sister, 62-year-old Donna Plew, in her home on East Indiana Street in Vancouver, Washington. He had moved there from Oregon after Donna's husband died in September of 2008. On Friday, February 6, 2009, Michelle Kraft and her husband, Keith James, arrived at their adult daughter's home on Indiana Street to pick her up for dinner at 7:15 p.m. As she was walking out to the car, their daughter heard 3 loud noises she feared were gunshots. As the family drove away, they happened to glance over towards Donna's house as they passed it. They saw a pickup truck that had been backed into the driveway. Its driver's side door was open and a man was lying on the ground with his leg up against it. A woman lay on the ground in front of the truck. The 2 people on the ground were Timothy and Donna. They had each been shot in the head and did not survive their injuries. Each of his siblings left behind children and grandchildren. Donna's quiet neighborhood was not usually the scene of any kind of violence, and her neighbors were shocked by the crime. Police quickly came to the conclusion that the murders had not been random and that Donna and Timothy must have known their killer. Unfortunately, no one witnessed the killer leave the scene, leaving police without a major lead to follow. Wally Steffen worked in law enforcement for 36 years, eventually becoming a detective with the Vancouver Police Department. After his retirement, he continued working on Donna and Timothy's case as a volunteer investigator with the Clark County Sheriff's Office. He said in 2016 that he has identified a person of interest he believes is responsible for the murders. Despite the passage of time, he still believes this person can be brought to justice. This is a case that is solvable, he told ABC 6 News. Something can be done, and we're just trying to get this case into the court system. Despite having 9 massive binders of evidence and a potential suspect, there is still not enough evidence to bring charges up against anyone and finally get justice for Donna, Timothy, and their family. Wally Steffen believes that there are members of the public who have the necessary information about the case to move it forward. Step up, make a statement, tell the truth, and help the prosecutor do his job, he asked of them. 14-year-old Carla Atkins and 16-year-old Vicky Stout lived in a mobile home just outside the small town of Dover, Tennessee with their mother, 4 brothers, and 2 other sisters. The sisters were half-siblings who had the same mother. Vicky's father, Leland Stout, had been murdered just a year after she was born. His roommate had stabbed Leland to death because he had been singing and keeping him awake. On the afternoon of September 17, 1980, the sisters rode the bus home from school and decided to walk down State Route 79 to an establishment called The Furnace, which was less than a mile away from their home. The Furnace was a restaurant, a bait shop, and a convenience store, and Carla and Vicky went there to buy snacks. After they left the store, witnesses saw them as they were talking to a man in a blue truck. They were never seen alive again after that sighting, and their mother, Margie, reported them missing to the police after they failed to return home. It was out of character for Carla and Vicky to go off on their own, but they were still initially categorized as runaways by the authorities after they were reported missing. Their family continued searching for them for the next 2.5 weeks. On October 5th, 2 hikers were walking along an old logging trail in what is now known as the Between the Lakes National Recreation Area. They Vicky and Carla's bodies buried in shallow graves, 75 feet apart from each other. Autopsies would reveal that each of them had been shot in the head with a shotgun. It appeared the girls had been killed where they were found. K-9 units were brought in to search the area where the remains were found. Investigators tried to connect the case to others in nearby areas, and more than 30 potential suspects were identified. However, the case remained unsolved. In 2015, 35 years after Vicky and Carla were killed, District Attorney Ray Crouch reopened the case, conducting new interviews and asking the FBI for assistance because Carla and Vicky's bodies had been found on federal land. The sketches of the man witnesses saw in the bloop truck talking to Carla and Vicky were also released to the public, along with a new sketch developed by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, which shows what the man the witnesses saw may look like having aged 35 years. In 2016, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam announced a reward of $1,000 for information that led to the arrest and conviction of the sisters' killer. Carla and Vicky are buried next to each other in the Standing Stone Cemetery. Despite the ongoing efforts of numerous agencies, decades after Carla and Vicky's deaths, the case remains unsolved. Their sister, Patricia Gordon, however, has not lost faith that whoever took her sisters from her will one day be held accountable. They will get their justice someday. They'll get what's coming to them, whether it be in my lifetime or not, she said in 2018. For this case, we're in North Oak Cliff, Dallas, Texas. In 2020, James, known as Jamie, and Jennifer Faith lived together after 15 years of marriage. Their story began on a blind date, where they talked for hours, amazed by how much they had in common. From that night onward, they were inseparable. Jennifer, who had been married twice before, had a daughter named Amber from her first marriage. Her first husband did not want children, and their relationship ended when she discovered she was pregnant. Jennifer juggled finishing her thesis, graduating, and giving birth to Amber, all in the span of a month. She later married a man named Rick, but that marriage ended quickly as well. When she met Jamie years later, everyone remarked that they seemed like the perfect match. Jamie quickly became completely devoted to both Jennifer and Amber, embracing them as his family. They married in Las Vegas in 2012. Amber loved Jamie like a father and asked him to adopt her and make it official. He was so emotional and he couldn't sign the papers quick enough. Jennifer said that Jamie was the only father Amber ever really knew, having been in her life since she was 8. It seemed everything had fallen into place for the three of them. Friends were so happy for the couple to have finally found each other after so many years of heartbreak for Jennifer and for Jamie, who told his friends he thought he would be single forever. They were a fun couple to be around, always up for doing something social, and loving to host parties. Jennifer was in healthcare administration and Jamie had worked as an executive in the IT department at American Airlines for 7 years. His friends said computers and tech were his thing, going back as far as school, and working his way up to a top career was always on the cards for him. He was a big gamer and sports fan too. Jamie and Jennifer lived a comfortable life and did lots of traveling together. So when US Airways and American Airlines merged and Jamie's job called for him to move, they were happy to do so. The Faith family relocated to Dallas, moving into a nice house on a quiet street, the 1000th block of South Waverly Drive. They always got each other cute gifts and presents, whether there was an occasion or not, and loved any chance for a celebration. For Valentine's that year, Jennifer had bought Jamie a personalized book thanking him for making her life so wonderful. On October 8, 2020, the couple celebrated the 15th year anniversary of their first date. A huge milestone. The next morning at 7:30 a.m., the pair set out on a walk together with their dog Maggie. It was light outside, quiet and peaceful. The couple's Ring doorbell picked them up as they left and headed down the street. Without warning, a masked man started approaching them from behind. He pulled out a gun and fired 9 shots in very quick succession, 7 of them hitting Jamie. 3 bullets to his head, 3 to his chest, and 1 to his groin area. Between the shots and Jennifer screaming, people quickly started coming out of their houses. The shooter then turned his attention to Jennifer, knocking her to the floor and duct taping her wrists. He then tried to pull her rings off and even made an attempt to attack Maggie. As Jamie lay on the ground, the man snatched off his wedding ring, got into a small black truck and sped away. The smell of gunpowder filled the air as people stood looking in horror, many of them on the phone to 911. Authorities got there fast, but there was nothing anyone could do. 49-year-old Jamie Faith was dead. Neighbors consoled a distraught Jennifer outside. It was such a shocking and heartbreaking scene. One minute she had been celebrating her 15-year anniversary and walking her dog. The next her husband was shot dead right in front of her and her life in Amber's had been turned upside down. But as upset as Jennifer was, the police had no time to waste and she was swiftly asked to come in and give a statement. For something like this to happen in broad daylight was staggering and no one could draw any conclusions as to who would want Jamie dead. But sadly, police said Jamie's murder was one of many violent crimes in Dallas that year. The city reported more than 200 homicides in 2020 alone. Even though this was the case, it seemed whoever had done this, they were brazen and took a big risk. It all seemed so personal and so intentional. Was it possible that Jamie knew his killer, or was it a robbery that had gone horribly wrong? But he had been shot before anything was taken from him. It seemed that the theft was an afterthought. Why such a brutal killing? Was duct taping Jennifer a potential attempt at an abduction? There were so many layers and so much to unpack. All Jennifer could tell them was that the shooter was male and quite broad, wearing a blue face mask and a dark hoodie. She said he had really dark and piercing eyes too. Another neighbor that had ran out to help confirmed that same description. The only clues that the police had were that the bullets had come from a .45 caliber pistol and the vehicle that was seen speeding away was a black Nissan Titan with a T sticker on the back. A T they assumed stood for the Texas Rangers, making them think that the killer was at least living in that area. A GoFundMe was set up to help support Jennifer with funeral costs and support hers and Amber's lives without Jamie. It soon raised over $60,000. The person organizing it for Jennifer said she couldn't believe how fast the money was pouring in. Everyone wanted to help in any way they could. The neighbors took it in turns to make Jennifer meals and keep her company, making sure she was keeping her strength up and was never alone. Soon more than 50 families around the neighborhood were helping in delivering groceries and household items. Jennifer held 2 funerals for her husband, one in Dallas and one in Phoenix. There were lots for people to take with numbers on to call in case they thought of something that might help with the case. Everything from key rings and cards to coasters. Investigators were continuing to draw blanks. There was no one in Jamie's life that was standing out as a potential person of interest, let alone a suspect in his murder. To commit a crime like this all for a couple of rings? It seemed so extreme. Experts said it had all the markings of a professional hit, a planned ambush, not a random chance attack. Jamie had installed some Ring doorbells and the one near their back gate had picked up something quite sinister. In the early hours of the morning, just a short time before Jamie was shot, a man could be seen walking in the garden of the house next door. The house was empty at the time, so it definitely wasn't a neighbor, but his build did seem to fit the description that Jennifer had given them. This was about 2:30 a.m. Skulking nearby and watching the house of the person that would be dead just hours later gave the police grounds to conclude that this was not a random or impulsive robbery. This was a murder that had been planned. They needed to talk to Jennifer again to see if anything else was coming back to her. Anything at all that might give them more clues. They asked to check her phone and she freely handed it over. It was here they did find something of interest, but not at all what they were expecting. Authorities found a text she had sent to a friend talking about a man called Darren, someone she admitted to having an emotional affair with. Oddly, There were no messages between her and Darren at all, but they were able to find out his last name and where he lived. His name was Darren Lopez, and he lived over 600 miles away, just outside of Nashville, on a very vast and very rural property. Authorities local to Darren Lopez learned that he owned the exact make and model of the vehicle they were looking for, a black Nissan Titan pickup truck with a T sticker on it. They fed the information back to the police in Dallas, and they coordinated an aerial search of his house and put him under surveillance. Sure enough, the truck was there. They obtained his bank and phone records too. And with these, suddenly everything started to move a lot quicker. Despite the fact there were no messages between them on Jennifer's phone, Darren had not deleted anything. Between September 20th and October 20th, just 1 month, Darren and Jennifer had exchanged more than 14,000 calls and text messages, 100 and 100 each day. And strangely, the only time they had seemingly not had contact was the day of Jamie's shooting. A whole 28-hour period was totally silent. On October 8th, the same day Jennifer and Jamie were celebrating their anniversary, Darren got his car serviced before entering Jamie and Jennifer's address into Google Maps. His phone was then tracked as he made the almost 12-hour drive to Dallas, Texas. His cards showed that he had stopped at some gas stations on the way to top up the tank, buy a Red Bull, and take out cash. As images of the truck were circulated with the all-important T sticker on the back, Jennifer sent Darren a message with a link to an article about the case, which showed a photo of the T sticker on the truck. She said, "I woke up in a bit of a panic. Something is eating away at me, telling me you need to take the sticker out of the back window of the truck. I don't normally overreact like this. Really think you need to get that sticker off ASAP. Like today." The next day, Darren picked the sticker off, but it was too late as he was already being watched and police had clocked the sticker when they flew over his house. Darren and Jennifer were suddenly their prime and only suspect. The pair actually went further back than people realized. They had dated through high school and college, but broke up after Darren finished his basic training and was deployed to Korea. Jennifer moved on and married her first husband, and the pair lost contact. Darren would also marry and have 4 daughters, but in 2018 he and his wife had parted ways. Friends said after the split and leaving the army, he had become increasingly isolated. While serving, he had suffered a brain injury when a bomb at the side of the road in Iraq went off, killing 19 of his friends. When he left the army, he was dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, and this, coupled with where he lived and his ongoing divorce, meant his feelings of loneliness were amplified. His daughters soon moved out to live with their mother, and when the pandemic hit, his friends really worried that he would retreat even further. But Darren decided to use it as a chance to reach out to old friends. In March 2020, Darren made contact with Jennifer via an email he'd found on LinkedIn 7 months before Jamie was murdered. In his first email, he said he had been following her on social media for a couple of months. He talked about his life, his children, reminisced about their past together, and told them that she unknowingly helped him to get through 20 years in the army. He admitted he had wanted to write to her for a while and said he had been thinking of her a lot over the years. Jennifer replied a few hours later and seemed practically giddy about the email. She said she too had been searching for him. She even knew he had lost his father in 2015. Her email was far longer and more in-depth than Darren's had been, and she was going into immense detail about every part of her life, family, marriages, attaching pictures too. She signed her email off by saying, "I'm certain you weren't expecting a book of response back to you, but once I started typing, I couldn't stop. I really hope you're doing well and you are happy. I have definitely missed you over the years, and there have been so many times I've wanted to talk to you. Thank you for being persistent in looking for me. Love, Jen." Before long, they were having an emotional affair, talking about 5-year plans and how they wanted to be together one day. Jennifer called him her soulmate, but Darren said he was hesitant, and although there were feelings there, he didn't want to break up her marriage. Jennifer told him there was no intimacy between her and Jamie anymore, and Darren said she needed to be honest with him and tell him how she felt. But it still felt like a piece of the puzzle was missing. They continued to look into the emails and recover ones that had been deleted. As they did this, Jennifer, none the wiser, was trying to get hold of the life insurance. In November 2020, she initiated a claim with Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, seeking $629,000 but she found out that until they could rule her out as a suspect, she was unable to withdraw anything. She sent Darren a text message, and the pair seemed confident they would get the money eventually and discussed buying a house together in Tennessee. Jennifer had given Darren a lot of money in gifts since they first started talking, including a new TV and 2 credit cards. Credit cards that she paid off with the $60,000 she received from the GoFundMe. Darren was in big trouble financially. His house was about to be foreclosed on after he had failed to make mortgage payments for several months, and his water had been shut off too. In one email, Jennifer wrote to him, "Here's both of my major CCs. Amex has no limit, and I think the Visa has like $35,000. Please don't hesitate to use them for whatever you need, especially when it's stuff for the girls." As 2021 came around, the police finally felt they had enough to move in and arrest Darren. But before they did, they wanted to see if the pair slipped up anymore. On January 10th, the detectives set up a meeting with Jennifer. Before the meeting, she sent Darren a message and said, "Don't text me Monday. I'm going to factory reset my phone on Sunday night after deleting texts. If asked about you, you are an old friend going through a divorce. We talk every night because I am helping/giving support with the girls, just in case they pulled phone records and ask." The next day, January 11th, 2021, they showed up at Darren's house with handcuffs. He was arrested on a state murder charge and was charged with a federal gun crime. He pleaded not guilty to both and was held on a $1 million bond. In his house, they found the same gun they were looking for in connection with Jamie's murder, confirmed via ballistic testings, and he had credit cards in Jennifer's name. Traces of Jamie's blood were later found on the gun too. In his car, a blue face mask thought to be worn on the day of Jamie's murder was also found. Jennifer was spoken to again following his arrest, but she denied there was anything inappropriate going on between the pair, saying they were just close. But the woman who just couldn't stop talking was now very quiet. She'd been asking for help in finding her husband's killer for months, and now they had arrested someone, but suddenly she didn't have anything to say. A week later, Jennifer transferred $118,000 from her checking account to an account belonging to an undisclosed third party. A few days after that, she asked someone else to send a message to Darren. "I've just needed to be cautious because every communication is being monitored. Please tell him ASAP that I will always be his." Darren responded via the same person and said, "Please stay strong for us." The walls were caving in on Jennifer. And less than a month later, in February 2021, 48-year-old Jennifer Faith is now facing obstruction of justice charges related to the murder investigation of her husband, a charge she pleaded not guilty to. But the investigation was far from over and more was coming out by the day. They had been going through their emails and recovering them slowly but surely. It turned out that just a few months after they had started talking, things had taken a dark turn. As well as Jennifer emailing Darren from herself, she set up a fake email account under Jamie's name, and using this, she started up correspondence with Darren. The first email was immediately graphic and aggressive and detailed a long list of physical and sexual abuse Jamie had inflicted on Jennifer. It also included photos of alleged injuries, but it was all Jennifer, and the pictures would turn out to have come from stock image sites. Not a shred of evidence ever corroborated anything that she had said about Jamie being abusive. An expert said it was all one awful lie after another. Darren replied to who he thought was Jamie and said, "I've been talking with her at night because she is terrified of you. You give her nightmares. I will get involved to make sure she is safe and unhurt and do that in any way I can." He finished his email by saying, "Be the husband you say you want to be." Another email showed a picture of a wound to a person's neck captioned with, "Good stuff. Enjoy knowing you can't do a thing about it." This picture was in fact real, but it was from a car accident that Jennifer was involved in 8 years prior. She was telling Darren that Jamie was beating her, sexually assaulting her, and letting other men sexually assault her, burning her and attacking her with weapons. Jennifer was going to extreme and disturbing lengths to get Darren's attention, spreading the most vile lies about her husband and really manipulating everyone. It is unknown when or how this happened, but at some point Jamie found out about the affair. Not the lies she was saying about him, but the communication between her and Aaron. He was absolutely broken by it. In August, Jennifer told a friend that she put the brakes on her relationship with Darren because Jamie was so hurt and she just couldn't do it to him. But this didn't happen. Jennifer created a second fake email account pretending to be a friend of her and Jamie. A friend that had seen the abuse happening and wanted Darren to do something about it to save Jennifer. And finally, after several months of creating the perfect storm and web of lies, Jennifer contacted Darren by phone asking him to kill Jamie for her. Darren said if I didn't do something, she was going to die. I made that commitment right there. As October came around, the plan was in place. Darren made the 10-hour drive ready to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He snuck into the garden next door and waited for 5 hours until the couple went on their walk. After he shot Jamie, stole his ring and fled, he tossed his wedding ring out the window. The amount the investigation had unraveled was gobsmacking to detectives. Flash forward again to February 2021. Darren was now in prison awaiting trial, and Jennifer was also making her court appearances on the obstruction of justice charge. Jennifer wrote a letter to Darren after she learned that he had heard about the fake email accounts and quite obviously realized, although it justified nothing he had done, he had been duped by her. Just a quick note to say, I never lied to you and I never send you emails from any account but mine is me. There is a ton more I wish I could say but I can't right now, she said in part. Despite the proof that she had created and was the person using the accounts, she still doubled down and stuck to her lies. Darren's lawyer said it took him a further 6 months to convince him that Jennifer had fabricated everything about Jamie. In October that year, 1 year after Jamie had been killed, police issued another charge to Jennifer. New this morning, the Dallas woman whose boyfriend allegedly shot and killed her husband is now charged with orchestrating the murder. A charge of use of interstate commerce in the commission of a murder for hire, an offense that carries a potential death sentence. Knowing the death penalty was on the table if found guilty, and seeing the amount of evidence against her, Jennifer Faith suddenly had a change of mind. She pleaded guilty, and in return prosecutors agreed to drop the obstruction charge and recommended a sentence of life imprisonment. As part of the plea, the prosecution wanted something they felt was very important for Jamie's family and friends. Jennifer had to admit that she was never in any way, shape, or form abused by Jamie. She signed to say and agree that it was completely false. In February 2022, Jennifer Faith was handed a life sentence. The judge called her pure evil and ordered her to pay $6,500 in restitution to Jamie's family and a $250,000 fine. While in prison, though, Jennifer requested that $200,000 from Jamie's assets were transferred to her, something detectives called spineless and showed her true character. This wasn't someone that pleaded guilty because she wanted to admit her part and show remorse. It was because she only had herself and her best interests in mind. Jennifer's second husband Rick also showed up and said as awful as this all was, he was actually not surprised. He called her the most evil person he had ever met. She told him that her first husband had abused her. It was almost identical to what she had told Darren. Rick said the stories he had heard about her first husband were so awful, so violent and so graphic that he said he wanted to kill him. Jennifer enjoyed toying with him and seemed to relish in watching him get angry and upset on her behalf. Again, there was not a shred of evidence to suggest that she had suffered any abuse at the hands of her first husband. Despite Jennifer's plea, Darren was still pleading not guilty, and in July 2023, jury selection for his trial began. His lawyer argued that because Darren believed Jennifer was facing immediate harm when he shot Jamie, this was a use of self-defense that could be considered justified under Texas law. They also argued that because of his post-traumatic stress disorder and his brain injury, he was easily manipulated and taken advantage of by Jennifer. If convicted of first-degree murder at trial, he was facing a sentence range of 5 to 99 years. If found guilty of murder in the second degree, the sentencing range would be 2 to 20 years. There was so much to present to the jury: the texts, the emails, the CCTV, the truck, the gun. Despite how many witnesses would be called, there was really only one person the public and media wanted to hear from: Darren himself. And to their surprise, he opted to testify and share his side. In July 2023, almost 3 years after Jamie was killed, a verdict was reached. Darren Lopez was later sentenced to 62 years in prison. The now 51-year-old said that when he was arrested, he truly believed it was worth it because he had saved Jennifer and Amber's lives from what he thought was a dangerous person. I became her weapon. I understand that. But he added that Jennifer, in his mind, was the true criminal, and he was happy that she was behind bars too. He said he would file an appeal. Prosecutors said there were so many other avenues he could have taken, but that was the option he chose. Everybody did acknowledge, however, that he had shown remorse for killing Jamie and had at least admitted his part. In an interview with Dateline 2020, Darren was asked, "Do you think she ever really loved you?" He shrugged and said, "I don't know." Sources say that Amber moved out of the area with the family dog Maggie and still talks to her mother in prison a couple of times a week. Everybody that donated to the GoFundMe was refunded. As with many cases we cover, there are more questions than answers. What made Jennifer do this? What made her think this was a good idea and the only solution? To go from being in a 15-year relationship with a man she spoke nothing but highly of, to planning his murder just a few months later. To put such a twisted plot in motion, dragging Jamie's name through the mud as she did, and then facilitating his demise. The rate at which this had all escalated is scary. I've not been involved in a case that had more twists and turns than this particular case, said the prosecutor Rick Calvert. It is a case as cruel, cold, and calculated as it is senseless and frankly strange. The one thing that everyone said about Jamie Faith was that he worshipped his wife and adored his daughter Amber. He had the perfect family, the perfect job, and in his eyes the perfect life, and one he had waited a long time for. To have this life snatched away in such frightening circumstances, and never knowing that the woman he thought was his soul mate had orchestrated everything. On July 16, 1973, 21-year-old Conchetta Sarah, known to everyone as Penny, took a day off from her job as a dental assistant to go shopping in New Haven, Connecticut. She borrowed her father's car for the outing, parking it on the 9th level of the Temple Street garage just before 1 p.m. Shortly after, 2 teenagers witnessed Penny running away from a man. They thought she had escaped because they saw the man return to the car moments later, holding something shiny in his hand. Tragically, Penny had not escaped. She had tried to flee up a staircase, but the attacker caught up with her after only a few steps and stabbed her once in the chest. Her body was left curled in the fetal position in the narrow concrete stairwell. Penny was mature beyond her years, shaped in part by difficult circumstances. She lost her mother, Pauline, to cancer in 1963 when she was just 11 years old. Afterward, Penny took on many of her mother's responsibilities to help maintain the household while her father continued running the break center he owned. She cooked meals, decorated the family home, did the shopping, and cared for her beloved younger sister, Rosemary. Penny's father, John Zara, would say in 1984 that Rosemary had been 100% dependent on her older sister, but his friends and family said he too relied on Penny just as much. After John was notified of his daughter's death, he was unable to eat or leave his house for several days. Perhaps because of her maturity, Penny had dated a man who was 7 years her senior. The couple was engaged to be married, but Penny had broken off the relationship because of their frequent arguments. Police looked at Penny's ex as a potential suspect early on in their investigation, but he had an alibi corroborated by numerous witnesses, and his fingerprints did not match ones in evidence. Decades later, DNA evidence would also exclude him. Furthermore, the evidence at the parking garage indicated that Penny had not been killed for personal reasons. She appeared to have been killed after someone tried to steal her father's car. The car was a blue 1971 Buick Electra that by all accounts was a very nice vehicle that could have been attractive to a car thief. 2 weeks before she was killed, Penny had driven the car to Florida for a vacation. She had brought a knife with her that she had used to slice bread and cheese on the trip, and it was known to still be in the car. However, the knife was not there when police processed the car. There was also a blood trail throughout several levels of the garage and blood in the car. Police believed that someone came up to Penny to steal the car and she stabbed him with the knife from the car in self-defense, most likely on his left wrist based on the blood trail evidence. This apparently angered her attacker as he chased after her as witnessed by the 2 teenagers instead of just taking the car after she fled. After stabbing her in the staircase, he did steal the car but became disoriented and could not find his way out of the double-tier parking garage. He therefore abandoned the Buick on the garage's 7th level where it would later be found, leaving its keys and Penny's handkerchief, both covered in blood, on the ground nearby. He then left a blood trail on the 6th and 5th levels as he went to retrieve the car he had driven to the garage. Shortly after Penny was seen running for her life, a man believed to be her killer drove up to exit the garage and handed the attendant a bloody parking ticket. The attendant asked the man who appeared to be injured if he needed help, but he said no. The attendant then simply wiped away the blood to see how much the man needed to pay him. He did not take note of the car's license plate as it rapidly drove away after the man paid the parking fee. There had been 2 security guards assigned to the garage that day, but they had gone across the street to get a cup of coffee together at the time of Penny's murder. John Serra sued the owners of the garage for negligence and ultimately settled with them out of court for $200,000. $30,000 of that money was offered as a reward for information that led to the arrest of Penny's killer. The rest of it went towards John's personal investigation into the case. For at least the first decade after his daughter's murder, John Serra worked 8 hours a day on the case in addition to running his business full-time. He called the police multiple times a day and did provide them with some leads that kept he hired a lawyer and a private investigator. He spent his evenings driving the streets of New Haven and visiting the parking garage. He would look at the left wrists of every man who came into his business or he passed on the street, trying to find a scar that could have been from the wound Penny inflicted on her killer. When none of these efforts identified the murderer, he began consulting with psychics. Every year on the anniversary of Penny's murder, John would take out an ad in the New Haven Register with his daughter's picture and a reminder that her killer had still not been found. The case appeared to be solved in 1984 when an arrest was finally made in the case. Anthony Galino had attended high school with Penny and was therefore one of the thousands of people interviewed by the police in the years following her murder. By 1981, they had begun focusing in on him. Galino's ex-wife came in to speak with the police about him. Galino had been physically abusive towards her and had once threatened to do to her what he had done to Penny Serra. He would deny ever making such a statement. He also had a scar on his left wrist where it was believed that Penny had stabbed her killer. He was arrested for Penny's murder on July 3, 1984. When Galino was arrested, he told police his blood was type O, which was the same type as the blood left at the crime scene by the killer. However, they never tested his blood to confirm this. The test would not be performed until May of 1987, right before the start of his trial. Galino actually had type A blood. This eliminated him as a suspect and the murder charge against him was dropped. According to Galino's attorney, the damage the arrest caused ruined his client's life. Galino died of cancer in 2008 at the age of 57. In the 1990s, authorities again thought they had found Penny's killer, an Albanian immigrant who worked in a restaurant Penny frequented and was a patient at the dental office where she worked. 2 of his dental bills had been found in the Serra car, and the lot attendant believed the man who given him the bloody ticket had an accent. On 2 separate occasions a year apart, authorities had applied for warrants to arrest him, but each time the judge refused to sign them due to a lack of evidence. Despite his years of fighting for justice for his daughter, John Serra would not live to see her killer arrested. He passed away in 1998 at the age of 74. Even as he was dying, he continued to advocate for Penny. He called Dr. Henry Lee, the forensic scientist who had been doing work on Penny's case from his hospital bed, begging him not to forget about Penny after he was gone. At the time of that final conversation, Dr. Lee did have a strong possible suspect, but he was unable to tell John Serra about him. A bloody, unidentified fingerprint had been found on a box of tissues inside the car Penny had been driving on the day of her murder. Police had never been able to find a match to it until 1997. That year, a new search was run and finally identified it. It was the right thumbprint of a man named Edward Grant of Waterbury, Connecticut. Grant's fingerprints had not been in any criminal database until 1994, when he was arrested for domestic violence against his then-fiancée. However, authorities did not want to arrest Grant based just on one fingerprint, so further forensic tests were performed. In addition to the fingerprint, the other main piece of evidence in the case that had been preserved was Penny's handkerchief, which was found near the car. It was blood from Penny and from an unknown male, presumably her killer, who was believed to have been injured by Penny. The DNA from the blood on the handkerchief was a match to Grant's DNA. In addition, chemical analysis of paint chips found the Buick tied them to the auto body shop Grant had owned at the time of Penny's murder. On June 24, 1999, less than 8 months after the death of John Serra and almost 26 years after the murder of Penny Serra, 56-year-old Edward Grant was arrested for the crime. Grant maintained his innocence and claimed that he had been in Vermont on July 16, 1973. He did also acknowledge in court documents that he was involved in a Jeep accident in 1964 while serving in the Connecticut National Guard, and that he sustained a serious head injury that required the placement of 4 metal plates in his skull. Following this injury, he suffered from memory lapses and mood swings. At trial, his attorneys argued that there was no identified motive for their client to kill Penny, and that the evidence had been in storage for too long before it was tested for DNA. Grant's trial lasted 20 days. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Grant guilty of Penny Serra's murder on May 28, 2002. Rosemary Serra was in the courtroom when the verdict was read and wept when she heard it. "After this many years, my family can finally rest in peace. My father had faith in the system, and now I can too," she said as she left the courthouse. Grant was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He still maintains his innocence and remains incarcerated at the McDougall Walker Correctional Institute. 34-year-old Freddy Farah was a loving husband to his wife Nadia and doting father to his son and 3 daughters. He owned the Grand Park Food Store on Kings Road in Jacksonville, Florida, and was working there on May 22, 1974. Around 2 p.m. that day, a tall and thin African-American young man came into the store and asked Freddy where the frosting was. Freddy pointed him in the right direction. The young man picked up some items and then came up to the register, placing a box of cake mix, a can of frosting, and an open can of soda on the counter. He then asked what the total he owed for the items was. However, instead of paying for his items, the young man took out a gun, pointed it at Freddy's head, and demanded money. Freddy brought his hands up and the gun went off. Freddy was shot in the head and died from his injuries. His killer fled the store on foot without taking any money from the register. Freddy's children were just 11, 8, 6, and 5 at the time of his death. So many details of the murder are known because there was a witness to it in the store that day, 14-year-old Annette Bryant. Fingerprints were also found in the items the killer had left behind on the counter, but no match to them was found in 1974. Even with the fingerprints and an eyewitness, Freddy's killer was not found, and the case went cold for more than 40 years. In 1998, the fingerprints were again run through the automated fingerprint identification system, but again no match was found. In 2016, they were run through AFIS again, but this time they found a match. 2 fingerprints found on the can of frosting, 1 fingerprint from the box of cake mix, and a palm print on the can of soda all belonged to a 59-year-old named Johnny Miller. Miller had been just 17 years old at the time of Freddy's murder. Sometime after it occurred, he had moved to New Orleans, where he had gone on to be a popular street performer in the French Quarter known as Uncle Louis. His prints were on file as a result of a number of arrests for minor offenses. Before speaking with Miller, investigators re-interviewed Annette Bryant, who was then Annette Bryant Williams, to make sure she remembered what she had seen that day in 1974 well enough to still testify. She still remembered the crime in great detail. Detectives traveled to New Orleans to interview Miller, who denied any involvement in Freddy's murder and could not recall ever going into his store. Still, he was arrested on May 16, 2017 and sent back to Florida on July 26. He received support from New Orleans locals and tourists from around the world who had met him in the French Quarter. They raised $6,000 to help with his legal fees. On August 15th, a grand jury in Duval County indicted him on 1 count of first-degree murder. A deposition of Annette Bryant Williams was scheduled for January 18, 2018 as a part of the preparations for Miller's trial. Unfortunately, she passed away unexpectedly in December of 2017 at the age of 58. Without Annette, the case against Miller almost completely fell apart. Prosecutors could still present the fingerprint evidence, but only Annette's testimony could have tied the items left on the counter to the person who killed Freddy. They therefore offered Miller a deal that was approved by Freddy's. If he pled guilty to second-degree murder, he would be released, serving only the time he had been held awaiting trial. However, there was another major condition to the agreement. Miller would have to meet with the Farah family and truthfully answer all of the questions they had about the crime. Miller met with the family on April 20th, 2018. He told them that he actually knew Freddy fairly well because he visited his store regularly, sometimes multiple times a day. He told them stories about how friendly Freddy had been and how he would let kids who came in to buy snacks have the items they wanted even if they did not have quite enough money to pay for them. He claimed that on the day of the murder, he had simply found the gun somewhere and wanted to show it to Freddy. When he got to the counter, he had a sudden urge to rob the store. The gun went off accidentally when Freddy tried to swat it away. After running away in a panic, he had thrown the gun onto a train car. Miller answered all of the questions the family asked him. The Farrow family was convinced by some of the details Miller provided that he was telling them the truth. He also apologized to them dozens of times during the meeting, and the family ultimately decided to accept his apology. With this condition of the plea deal met, the arrangement was finalized at a court hearing on April 25th, and 61-year-old Miller was released from custody, having served only 344 days for Freddy's murder. He returned to New Orleans and to performing as Uncle Louie and remains a beloved member of the community there. While the short jail sentence is not what the Farah family had been hoping for, they are grateful to finally have answers to the questions that have bothered them for more than 4 decades. Am I upset that he is not spending time? I'd rather him answer my questions and give me the answers that I have been looking for all my life than to have him sitting in jail without anything, Freddy's son Bobby told the Florida Times-Union. That being said, Bobby will not tolerate Miller going back on the plea deal. Should Miller ever recant his confession, Bobby Farah has vowed to travel to New Orleans and follow Miller around the French Quarter as he tries to work with a sign reading "This man killed my father." On May 20th, 1987, 2 truckers were driving out of Columbia, South Carolina on Highway 378. As they passed through the town of Hopkins, they spotted what appeared to be a body in a ditch along the side of the highway, approximately a quarter of a mile down the road from the entrance to the McIntyre Joint National Guard base. They immediately notified the authorities. When police arrived, they found what would later be described as a very gruesome scene. The body was of a woman who had been shot in the face with a shotgun at close range. She appeared to have been killed at the location where she was found. Her untied shoes were found nearby. She did not have any identification with her, but she was eventually identified as 34-year-old Patricia N. Green. Patricia was a mother of 3 who lived in downtown Columbia with her children as well as her sister. Police had no leads in the case, and it almost immediately went cold. Evidence from the scene was collected and preserved. The investigator initially assigned to Patricia's case was Bill Simpson of the Richland County Sheriff's Department. At the time he was assigned the case, he had just notified the department that he would be leaving it for another position elsewhere. While he only worked on Patricia's case for a brief time, he would remain haunted by it for the next 3 decades. In 1997, the Richland County Sheriff's Department formed a cold case unit to look into old cases that had never been solved. By the beginning of 2017, they had solved 10 such cases. Jeff Fuller was a member of the unit. He had worked violent crimes with the Sheriff's Department early in his career, leaving the department in 1988 to join the State Law Enforcement Division. After his retirement from his position there, he returned to the Sheriff's Department to join the cold case unit. In February of 2017, Bill Simpson called Jeff Fuller to ask for the unit to look into Patricia's case. Despite the fact that the case was almost 30 years old, Bill was still bothered by the fact that it had never been solved and haunted by its gruesome details. Jeff Fuller agreed to take the case on, and within just a few weeks, it would become the 11th case closed by the cold case unit. DNA evidence was not widely used by the police at the time of Patricia's murder. In 2017, the preserved evidence from the case was re-examined in hopes that DNA could be found on it and identify a suspect. DNA was found on some of Patricia's clothing, and when it was run through a criminal database, there was a match: 53-year-old Philip Johnson. Johnson was already serving 4 life sentences at the Kirkland Correctional Institution. In 1988, he had been arrested for, and later convicted of, the murder of 4 women in Sumter County. Patricia Green's murder had occurred right in the middle of his spree. 2 of the women had been killed before her, and the other 2 were killed after her murder. The 4 murders Johnson was in prison for had all occurred within the same area. Patricia's murder hadn't been connected with these cases because it occurred far outside that area in the next county over. Investigators from Richland County went to Kirkland to speak with Johnson, who confessed to the crime even before he was told that DNA evidence had been found and implicated him in the crime. He was able to provide details about the murder that only Patricia's killer would have known. When he was asked what the motive for the murder had been, he said that there hadn't been one. He had been on a killing spree, and to him, Patricia Green had just been another person whose life he could take. The solving of the case was announced by Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott at a press conference on March 8, 2017. Patricia's family was notified before the announcement was made, and while they are relieved to finally have closure, they opted not to speak publicly about the case. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.